Welcome, everybody, to another installment of Noetic. My guest this afternoon is Dr. Jonathan Cook. It's our first Google Hangout, and today we'll be talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables. I had to blaze through this book in order to prepare for our seminar and greatly needed the clarification and elucidation of Dr. Cook. So I've got some questions here that I thought I would put to him, and we'll kind of go through them in a deep yet brisk way. So I guess the first one, Dr. Cook, is when and where did Hawthorne write The House of the Seven Gables?
Okay, so Hawthorne was living in Salem, Massachusetts when he published The Scarlet Letter in March 1850. And it was really a important moment in his career because this was his first really full-length novel, and it was a commercial success. I mean, in a modest way, and it was also a critical success. But the success came with a sense of a longing to leave Salem, Massachusetts, where he had gotten fired from the custom house in June, July 1849. So he was desperate to get out of Salem, and he now had some money to move his family. So he ended up accepting an invitation to rent a house in western Massachusetts in Lenox. So he was actually renting a house on the estate of a young woman and her husband who were, wealthy, and he moved there in the spring of 1850. He started the novel in July or August of 1850 and finished it about January 1851. It was published in March, April 1851. So he wrote it in about 6 months. And it was really a novel based on Salem events in Salem, Massachusetts. He doesn't name Salem in the novel, but it's clear that it's his hometown. And the narrator, it's a third-person narrator. He makes it clear that he knows a lot about the town, like as Hawthorne would have. The interesting thing about this book, though, is that he wrote it in the summer and fall of 1850, or more the fall and winter of 1850. When he was living in Lenox, and his neighbor was Herman Melville. So he and Melville got to be friends at this time. And Melville, of course, wrote a very positive review of a book that Hawthorne had published called Mosses from an Old Man. So he published in 1846. But Melville was reviewing it now 4 years later, just to review some book of Hawthorne's whom he had recently met. And Melville proclaimed him a literary genius. So Hawthorne, I think, was feeling good about his talent and his abilities as a writer, and I think that gave him a real impetus to, write the most interesting story that he could at the time, which was his second novel, published when he was still living in Lenox, Massachusetts, in the spring of 1851.
Oh, fantastic. And so what is the basic storyline of the novel, and how does it highlight issues of social class in antebellum America?
Okay, so the storyline is the first chapter begins in Salem, Massachusetts during the witchcraft era, 1692. And it shows a dispute between a leading Puritan of the era, Colonel Pynchon, and Matthew Maule, who was a plebeian who owned a piece of land that Colonel Pynchon wanted to build a house on. And this reflects some of the bad feelings that were going on between the settlers of Puritan era communities, Salem and Salem Village, where the witchcraft trials began. There was a lot of bad blood between neighbors, and the witchcraft trial just brought that out, because a lot of the accusations were against neighbors whose forfeited property would go into the hands of the people who were accusing them. So it was kind of a class warfare going on beneath the surface. So anyway, Hawthorne identified that in the past, of course, his ancestor John Hawthorne was one of the judges in the witchcraft trial, and so this feud between these two families, the Mall family and the Pynchon family, began because of the conviction of Matthew Mall for witchcraft. Colonel Pynchon accused Matthew Mall of witchcraft to be able to access his property, and build his own house on this property. The gist of the story, though, the gist of the novel takes place in the 1840s, late 1840s. The date is never given, but you can assume it's contemporary with the composition of the novel, and it's about the descendants of the Pynchon family who have inherited money over the generations because of the unlawful act of their original ancestor, Colonel Pynchon. And we assume at this point that there are no Malls living. The family that was more or less, depleted by Colonel Pynchon's seizure of their property. But the irony is that the son of the man executed actually helped build the mansion of Colonel Pynchon, which is the house that the characters at the beginning of the novel in the contemporary setting are living in, right? And it's an older woman, Hepzibah, and her brother, Clifford, who has served 30 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And it's about his return from prison and the fact that the contemporary equivalent of Colonel Pynchon, whose name is Judge Pynchon, who's a kind of a malicious hypocrite, is trying to get information from Clifford to find out the location of a deed to some Indian land that would make the family wealthier. I mean, this guy is already wealthy to begin with. So it's already, taking on the outlines of a dispute of different classes. But a lot of the novel is the Judge Pynchon persecuting Clifford and Hepzibah to get more money to find out where this missing Indian deed is. And it highlights the fact that, in America in the 1840s and 50s, there really was an increasing inequality between classes. And the fact is that the Whigs, who were the party of wealth at the time, well, later Republicans after 1856, but the Whigs in the 1830s and 40s were the party of the new money and the new industrialism. And I think Hawthorne was drawing attention to the fact that, a lot of these people making this big money at the time were not really favorable to democracy, and they were a little bit selfish, and we really should not let the country go into their hands all the time. Hawthorne, of course, was a firm Democrat, and he served as a customs inspector under Democratic presidencies. So that's a little bit of the social background and the storyline.
So, is the novel autobiographical, and if so, what ways?
Okay. Yes, there is oblique biography in the book. Of course, we rehearse the courtship of Nathaniel and Sophia Peabody, which began in the late 1830s and ended up in their marriage in 1842. We see that story played out to some extent in the romance between Holgrave, who's a young man living in the House of the Seven Gables, and Phoebe, who's a cousin of the Pynchons, who comes to stay at the house for a while in the summer during which the events take place. And Holgrave is living in the attic of this house. He's working as a daguerreotypist, which was, of course, the early form of photography in the 1840s. That's what it was called. And he's leading a kind of bachelor life. He's pursuing some social reform movements, and he's had a kind of a spotty career doing all kinds of other things. And then this young woman comes along, is living in the house. He falls in love with her, and they get married eventually after the novel closes. The interesting thing about the book is that it's a family dispute between malls and pensions, and Hawthorne's family history really has elements on both sides of that family divide, because the House of the Seven Gables is the Pynchon family are descendants of this Colonel Pynchon, who acted nefariously during the witchcraft trials. And of course, Hawthorne's relative, John Hawthorne, was involved in the witchcraft trials, and so he's kind of expiating the sin of having his ancestor convicting some of these witches in 1692 in the person of, in the caricature of Colonel Pynchon, right, a community leader in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, on the other hand, he himself, Hawthorne, grew up, relatively poor. His father died when he was very young, and he grew up as kind of within his mother's family, the Mannings, and they were Whigs, and his family were Democrats. And so he kind of felt like a poor relation throughout his childhood and his early youth, even though his Manning relatives, they paid for his education, they paid for him to go to Bowdoin College. So I think in some ways he felt like, and one of the reasons he was a Democrat was that he identified with, working class America and the need to, keep economic opportunity available for all. And so that part of the story relates to the Mall family, who were workmen. So it's interesting that, Hawthorne tells a story that includes elements of two families fighting, in which he could identify in some ways his own family with both sides of the battle. And there was actually a legendary dispute between the English family and the Hawthornes, something of a family feud as well, that ended in a marriage of the two families. So he himself had a sort of basic outline of the story in his head from his own family history, and he used his own experience of growing up in Salem to anchor the story.
So how does the novel illustrate Hawthorne's abiding preoccupation with the history of colonial Massachusetts and the city of Salem in particular?
Yeah, so I kind of got into that in the last couple of questions. Hawthorne was fascinated by history, and after he graduated from Bowdoin in 1825, he spent about 10 years in his family house in Salem reading from the literature of colonial Massachusetts. And he became a fiction writer as part of that process. So he was writing, the genre of fiction he was writing is called historical romance, meaning he takes events from the past and you weave an interesting story into it that might stretch the truth at certain points and cast a kind of idealized glow over the story. And that's really how his writing, his fiction came about. The great model of this kind of work was Walter Scott, right, who pioneered the historical novel in the 18 teens and 20s. So, people were reading Walter Scott and trying to think up ways to integrate historical narratives into fictional narratives. The problem in America was that we didn't have this really extensive past that they did in Europe or in Scotland, where Walter Scott was living, where he could take events of medieval and Renaissance history and tell these stories with all these kind of magical, romantic elements to them. Hawthorne look back to his Puritan past, only 100 or 200 years, and he would try to use those stories for his fiction. So he, the Scarlet Letter, obviously based on events in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1640s, so he was trying to, he wrote fiction about the contemporary world as well, and he was living in Salem, Massachusetts for a lot of his life in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and but he was a pioneer as a writer, because there really wasn't much in the way of original American literature when he was starting out. There were lots of imitations of English writers, but he really enriched that field by creating the genre of historical romance and giving it a lot of psychological depth. That was his gift.
So you sort of intimated that it was a type of romance in terms of the genre. I don't know if that's the full sort of genre name for it. I guess I'm curious, how you would categorize it, if you would go beyond romance. The House of Seven Gables is, and really, how does this influence the narrative?
Okay, well, it's historical romance, but in this particular case, it incorporates the element of Gothic. The Gothic was a form of fiction that was pioneered in England. The first recognized Gothic novel was Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764. And Gothic fiction took off in England in the 1780s and 90s. The big names in the 1790s were Anne Radcliffe, who published The Mysteries of Udolpho, and Matthew Lewis published The Monk. And these are classic sort of horror stories that involve, often they incorporate scenery from the Middle Ages. Classic Gothic fiction involves a castle where someone is imprisoned in the dungeon, and the person occupying the castle is an aristocratic usurper, and the true heir is the person in the prison, or is a peasant living on the estate. And so you have this, often you have an idea of a curse hanging over this person or the estate or the castle that is going to be resolved when the true hero comes in and the villain is killed or dies or whatever. Gothic fiction is very popular in the late 18th century, early 19th century. But Hawthorne was using some of this Gothic formula, because the House of the Seven Gables is kind of a Gothic castle where Hepzibah and Clifford are kind of like prisoners of the past, because they can't really leave this castle. There's a kind of a curse of, first of all, their sense of aristocratic privilege. They don't really want to mix with other people because they believe that they kind of are descendants of a proud family. But the only problem is, at the beginning of the book, they don't have any money. They're living in this house under the good auspices of Judge Pynchon, who owns the house. And so Hepzibah has to open up a cent shop to sell items like gingerbread cookies in the beginning of the book. And so she's contemplating class downward mobility, which is terrifying to her. So anyway, the Gothic motif comes in the fact that there's a curse on the family because of Colonel Pynchon's execution of Matthew Maule in the first chapter, right? He utters a curse. God will give you blood to drink, right? So that means that he's going to die somehow choking on his own blood, which he does, because he's discovered in the chair of his new house with blood all over his shirt, because he's had some kind of pulmonary episode of his, in his lungs. Now, a stroke at the time could mean any kind of effusion of blood, not just in the brain, but anywhere. So he seems to die of some kind of pulmonary stroke.
I know you've done some research on this particular character and mode of death and whatnot. There's supposed to be sort of a historical correlate for this personage. Death, right?
Well, that's right.
Because I thought that was really interesting, and not only that, where that expression came from, where that you'll choke on the blood, and how that is traced back to Salem.
Yeah. Well, the fact is the idea of God will give you blood to drink. It was something that was said in the book of Revelation, an element of vengeance against your enemies, and the fantastic psychodrama of the book of Revelation. One of the punishments will be that you will be punished by God by choking on your own blood. Well, this was said in historical, Salem in 1692. Sarah Good, who was one of the executed witches, said this to her judge, whose name was Noyes. He was one of the judges at the time, and he was condemning her. And the odd thing is that he actually died in the early 18th century choking on his own blood because of some kind of maybe tuberculosis or whatever. So people, this was mentioned in a well-known history of colonial Massachusetts by a guy named Hutchinson, and just buried in a footnote, actually. So the core of this curse and its fulfillment is from Puritan history, the Puritan history of Massachusetts, and its seemingly uncanny fulfillment of, the fulfillment of this curse by one of the witches on her judge condemning her. And Hawthorne lifted this idea of the curse and gave it to the Pynchon family. And it turns out that, Colonel Pynchon dies of choking on his own blood. And Judge Pynchon, who's the villain of the story, ends up dying, seemingly choking on his own blood. And we have a whole chapter of the novel describing him sitting in the chair, not moving, and the narrator kind of taunting him and saying, how come you're not getting out of your chair? You got all these appointments, you've got all these things to do, places to go, people to see. And, it's a very cruel chapter, but at the same time, it's brilliantly satiric, because Judge Pynchon is a villain who we realize by the end of the book he deserves all of this abuse and more because of what he's done to his cousin Clifford by contributing to his 30-year imprisonment for a crime he did not commit. In fact, for a crime that Judge Pynchon himself was more or less guilty of. So, Hawthorne creates really a tour de force, unlike any other piece of antebellum literature, in its kind of sadistic abuse of a dead body, but for satirical purposes.
A darker Weekend at Bernie's or something.
Yeah.
Now, I think it would be helpful to a lot of people if they could read your research on this. You want to take a moment to tell people where they can find that publication that goes deeper into that? Do you have it offhand?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the reason I'm really into this book, and particularly the character of Judge Pynchon, is I did an article for New England Quarterly. It came out in June 2015, and it's about the character of Judge Pynchon as his and his model, who is a guy named Charles Upham. He was the Whig politician who was largely responsible for getting Hawthorne fired from his job as a customs inspector in June and July 1849. And Hawthorne, the irony is that Hawthorne was a friend of his, This guy, Charles Upham, and by the way, the article is called "The Most Satisfactory Villain That Ever Was," Charles W. Upham and the House of the Seven Gables, New England Quarterly, June 2015. So Upham was Hawthorne's, they weren't really close friends, but Hawthorne admired Upham because he also was interested in the history of colonial Salem. And he wrote a book on the witchcraft scandal in 1831. He gave a couple of lectures on it because he was interested in that history. And then he published a short book on it in 1831. He also published a longer book later on in his life in the 1860s, I think, 2-volume work on Salem witchcraft. But he, you know, he made his living as a Unitarian minister in Salem. And the Hawthorne family was nominally Unitarian, but Hawthorne didn't go to church. So it could be that this guy, Upham, you know, was had some kind of grudge against Hawthorne for not going to church or something. But I mean, that's by the way. The fact is, they would see each other occasionally in Salem. They exchanged books with each other, and all of this changed, though, when Upham became a Whig. He had to stop being a minister, I think, in 1844-45, because he had a bronchial infection. And he had a kind of a gurgling sound in his throat that made it hard for him to give sermons. And in the novel, you see the character of Judge Pynchon having this kind of weird gurgling noise in his throat whenever he appears on the doorstep of the House of the Seven Gables. So the conclusion that you're led to believe is that somehow this is a manifestation of the illness that will eventually kill him, this kind of pulmonary hemorrhage that eventually kills him. And so Hawthorne was, you know, making a few little connections between Upham and Judge Pynchon, enough so that the knowing reader would see that this was a caricature of this hated figure who threw Hawthorne out of his job. You know, $1,200 salary he had, that was pretty important for Hawthorne and his family. You know, he had 3 kids by this point. And Hawthorne was very angry that Upham, his former friend, was leading the crusade to get him ousted because of the new president, Zachary Taylor. You know, he came into office in March 1849. And Taylor had said that we're not going to get rid of any Democrats as long as they're doing a decent job. You know, they're not incompetent or they're not corrupt. Well, Upham had to find a way to show that Hawthorne was both incompetent and corrupt. And he did so by accusing him of paying the people below him more money if they were Democrats than if they were Whigs. And then turning around and saying, well, Hawthorne really wasn't good at his job because he was a writer, he was an artist, he doesn't know anything about business, so we can't expect him to be really a good, efficient government worker. And that, both of those accusations really riled Hawthorne up, so he turned around and wrote a book where he used this enemy of his as the main villain.
What I thought was so interesting about that is that he includes, right, doesn't he include at the beginning of the book that, like, none of these people have correlates in real life. They're just sort of mixtures of some events or something like that. So on the one hand, he draws the parallels very tightly, but then sort of like covers himself, right? Yeah,
his preface specifically says, even though you might recognize the town of Salem in this book, it really has more to do with, you know, Never Never Land. And please don't make any connections with local people because there isn't one. But the funny thing is that there was an old Pynchon family in Salem who turned around and were very angry at Hawthorne for using their family name in the book and making them look bad. And of course, Hawthorne just had to shrug that off. but no one, Charles Upham did not. I mean, we have no idea whether he recognized himself in this book, or even if he read it. You would think that he would be very wary about reading a book about Salem by someone that he just did a nasty thing to, So there's no indication that Upham read the book, but anyone who knew anything about Hawthorne's firing should have probably guessed that the book would, try to get some vengeance against Upham in the character of Judge Pynchon. And Hawthorne's two sisters and his son, in correspondence, acknowledge the fact that it is actually based on him, but they don't go into any detail about what the similarities are. They just say, yeah, it's him, and here are a couple of things that they share, but nothing in any kind of depth.
Right. So, and I think you've already kind of done a little bit of this, but maybe you want to elaborate on some of the notable themes and events and characterizations in the novel. We've been doing that a little bit, but did you have further examples that you wanted to illumine for us?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about the book is that in the beginning you have these older people who are the main characters. Hepzibah, who's consistently called an old maid and a kind of helpless aristocratic woman who has to go out and open this scent shop, and it's really interesting to see this woman going into business with this scent shop. And there's a lot of interesting comedy in this book, unlike other Hawthorne fiction. Well, let's say the Blithedale Romance is the book he published after this. There's some satirical comedy, but this book has some wonderful comic scenes in it. For example, Hepzibah selling gingerbread cookies to this a little school kid named Ned, who comes in and eats all these camels and animals and the gingerbread cookie creatures, and every time he eats one, he goes out and then he comes back with another penny to pay for the cookie, and it's a wonderful scene of this kid just wolfing down these items, and then there's a wonderful scene of Clifford, who's the brother of Hepzibah, who's been in prison for 30 years for a crime he didn't commit, that actually Judge Pynchon was responsible for. His uncle, Jaffrey Pynchon, was the patriarch at the time, and Jaffrey, Judge Pynchon, as a young man, was kind of a wastrel, and he tried to get money by sneaking into his uncle's office and digging through drawers and looking for money, picking up some bills and looking for things he could walk out with to get some more money. As his uncle came in and caught him there and had a stroke, and then fell down and hit his head, so he had a crushed skull that might have looked like he was murdered. And Jaffrey, the death is made to seem as though Clifford Pynchon had done this crime and not his cousin, Judge Pynchon, who was not a judge at that point. So Clifford was serving time for a crime he didn't commit, and he's kind of a broken man, and he's a sort of artist figure who's living in the house with his sister, and he's really a kind of a hollow shell, but he's fixated on beauty, because he was sort of an artist type young man whose life has been destroyed. And at one point there's a political parade that comes by the house, and he's looking out the window, and he's so desperate to join in with the people, but he's so emotionally broken that he can't just go out and walk out and join them. So he's thinking of just throwing himself through the window, basically committing suicide to be able to join this group because of his desperation to somehow bond with the human race once again, because he's had such sensory deprivation as a prisoner. And then there's a wonderful scene outside with this organ grinder comes by, and his monkey is going around collecting change, and the organ grinder has a little display of activities as he cranks his organ. These little figures are there doing activities like a shoemaker and a guy, you know, proposing to a young woman, and he's turning the crank. And the way Hawthorne describes it, it's almost like, you know, this is life. It's just this repetitive, ridiculous little silly business. And it almost makes you think of Flaubert. When I'm thinking of Emma Bovary, where, you know, a couple of times later in the book when she's really desperate, she hears this guy singing this song, this old bum on the street. It's kind of a reminder about Hawthorne as a kind of a skeptic, a religious skeptic almost, pointing to just how kind of nasty and uninteresting life can be sometimes. That you know, is typified by this organ grinder. And then, of course, you have this great death scene of the judge sitting in his chair for almost 24 hours. You know, he comes in the late morning, and he's sitting in the afternoon, then the evening, and then he's sitting there the next morning when he's discovered by Holgrave, who comes downstairs and sees the body. Well, earlier than that, actually, just after he died, Clifford goes down and sees the dead body, and he grabs Hepzibah and says, "Let's get out of here. You know, this monster is finally dead. This guy really ruined my life. We got to get out of here." So they go and get on a train, and they just take the train into the countryside. And it's a wonderful chapter describing what it's like to be in a railroad car at this time, because, you know, this was almost brand new in the 1840s to be able to ride the train at 40, 50 miles an hour. And, you know, Clifford is speculating about all kinds of things about what this means for the future, you know, and for the progress of technology. And that's a wonderful chapter too.
One of my favorite things about this novel, one of the themes that I picked up on, is how obsessed it is with progress, or the prospect of progress, and how illusory it is. I think there's a passage, I don't know if I can remember the character, but he describes progress not as moving along linearly, and not as sort of this dog chasing its tail, but as a spiral into the future that offers ever greater refinement of previously tried ideas. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful passages.
Yeah.
In the entire. Do you remember that passage?
Yeah.
Did that stick out to you?
That is Clifford talking to a guy in the railroad car. And it just shows that Clifford is really kind of a philosopher, and he is evoking the idea of progress. You know, he's going out of the house, and he has this kind of infatuation with the idea of progress that shows that he's kind of been liberated from the oppressive weight of Judge Pynchon, who's been left behind dead in the house. So there's a kind of an immense feeling of liberation, and Clifford's conversation reflects this idea that somehow the future is going to be wonderful, and it reflects the dramatic breakthrough in technologies of the 1840s. You know, just think of the telegraph in 1844, which was, you know, pioneered in a message from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. You know, the first message was, "What hath God wrought?" You know, somehow the U.S. was becoming the sort of favored nucleus of a you know, progressively optimistic future. And railroads, of course, were just developing all over the north, mainly the north at this point. You know, 1849, California gold discovered. So you had a sense of infinite possibilities, and last of all, the U.S. had grown in territory after the Mexican War in 1848. A huge new territory was added to the West. California, all of that new territory. It doubled really the size. Maybe it increased the country by a third, I think, or even more. So you had a sense of really expansive optimism at that point.
I, I, I like the exploration of these themes and novels and stuff like that, and I think about it in regards to the sort of work that we do here at Noetic by trying to build more meaningful relationships over ideas. I remember, I think I've said this elsewhere in some of the educational materials that I've made, that there's a line from Thoreau. It's like, well, this is fantastic with the innovation of the telegraph that Maine can talk to Texas.
Yeah.
But what will they say to one another?
Yeah.
What do they say to one another? And I think that's kind of where we are with the internet right now.
Yeah.
And I think it's my own personal belief that we're due for an internet renaissance, because now we're all connected. And where I see what we're doing here right now in this moment and what we're doing at the larger educational platform, it's like fantastic. We're all connected, but are we doing anything beyond blathering about our political opinions or sharing cat memes or cyberbullying or whatever else is going on? Can we actually do something upbuilding with this connectivity that we have? And I think that's a theme that really drives me personally.
Yeah. Well,
so
it was been explored for a couple of centuries. The idea of progress has been on the table since the 18th century, and everyone, more thoughtful people look at technology and they say, well, what are the pluses, but then what are the minuses? I mean, and Hawthorne certainly, in terms of being a cultural critic, I mean, he had sort of conservative values. He was sort of ambivalent about the idea of progress, although he embraced positive change, but the big flaw in his outlook, his Achilles heel, was the fact that he did not see the injustice of slavery. He left the country in 1853, went to be consul in Liverpool, so he missed out on the growing crisis over slavery that was partially a result of the actions of his college friend Franklin Pierce, who was president from 1853 to 57. Because the Kansas-Nebraska troubles occurred under Franklin Pierce. And so Hawthorne was out of the country when a lot of this got worse and worse. And he came back in 1860. We're on the brink of Civil War, and he himself was a little half-hearted about supporting the Union. His friend Franklin Pierce was still kind of felt sorry for the South, and he gave a very notorious 4th of July speech in New Hampshire in 1863. Franklin Pierce gave the speech with Hawthorne on the podium, or on the stage with him, speculating about how we should end the war, as soon as possible, because it was unjust to the South, so Hawthorne, on the matter of slavery and race, that's where we can really fault him today for not being more enlightened in his views. But he was sort of a cultural conservative, unlike people like Thoreau and Emerson, who were his neighbors in Concord in the 1840s.
That was something I was going to ask you about. Not only, I guess I'm kind of interested in how these themes may be reflected in the fixation in daguerreotypes, this early form of photography. We see this sort of resignation towards innovation in the mouth of Clifford, but all I could tell throughout the entire story, it seemed like there was always discussion of getting a daguerreotype or or the daguerreotypist. Is there any special significance to that at all? That particular form of technology and how it reflects some of the conservative attitudes that Hawthorne may have had towards innovation and technology? It just I've never heard the word daguerreotype.
Yeah. Well,
So
to tell you the truth, it was a technology that it was exploding in the 1840s. I mean, it had come over, I think, about 1840, 41 to the U.S. from France, and it just took over because it was relatively easy to set up a studio and to read a book about the chemical processes that you use. And so you suddenly had all these new businesses opening up in major cities to have your daguerreotype taken. And you know, people didn't have to rely on paying a portrait painter to have an image of him, or a miniature painter, right? They could spend, well, you had to sit still in the beginning, I think, for about 15 minutes or so. Time got shorter and shorter over the decades. So I think by the 1860s, the exposure time was only a minute or two. But you'll notice in the first daguerreotypes, people looked very stiff, very posed, because they had to maintain those positions for, you know, 15 minutes without moving, or else they'll get a streak on the daguerreotype. So I think it was, you know, the character of Holgrave, his living is as a daguerreotypist, but as far as I remember, I don't think Hawthorne was really making any big statements about that technology. I think he was fascinated by the idea that somehow pictures can capture the soul of someone. So, you know, if you paint a picture, a painting, you're trying to find the inner essence of that person. And the same thing for a daguerreotype, that, you know, if you really look into a certain a photograph, you can sort of evaluate the character of the person, and that shows up when Clifford shows a daguerreotype of Judge Pynchon to Phoebe at the house to show her that this guy might have something fishy about him, because all she knows up to this point is that he's a guy who's come to the house of the Seven Gables with a big smile on his face looking for Clifford. And Holgrave is trying to show her that there's something corrupt about his character that we learn about by the end of the book. And he has taken the picture, or the daguerreotype of the judge. And then, of course, at the end of the book, we learn that Holgrave is a Maule. You know, he's the last descendant of the Maule family. So he is showing that, you know, revealing the whole history of the family feud between the Maules and Pynchons, because he knows the full story as the last descendant of this supposedly vanished race of working men.
Well, we're up a little bit of a break here, so we should probably kind of truck through these final questions.
Yeah,
if that's okay.
Sure.
I wondered if you could discuss the important impact of the nationally famous Salem murder of 1830 on the novel.
Yeah. Okay, well, just briefly, the Salem murder was really the biggest murder scandal of the era. It happened in April 1830. A wealthy Salem retired sea captain and shipping magnate, Joseph White, was found dead in his bed of multiple stab wounds and a smashed head. And the town of Salem was terrified, because they didn't know who had committed this murder. There was no obvious motive. And for days and days, people were, you know, locking their door and windows. And of course, Hawthorne was living in Salem at the time. It turns out he actually knew, you know, a lot of the people involved in this. So after a few weeks, through various events, the true story emerged, which was that this guy, Joseph White, had a grandniece who was married to a guy. There were these two Knapp brothers, Joseph and Frank Knapp, and they were hoping to inherit their relative's money if he died intestate. So they wanted him to die, and they didn't want him to have a will giving all his money to someone else. So they hired a guy named Richard Crowninshield, who was from a very prestigious family, but he was a total scoundrel and a ne'er-do-well. And he committed the murder and stabbed this guy Joseph White, and he was confronted and arrested, but he never went to trial because he hung himself in jail. And he did so because if he was not tried and convicted, they couldn't convict anyone else. So he was trying to protect the other people who might also be convicted as part of this conspiracy. Well, it turns out the two Knapp brothers were killed or executed for murder, and Daniel Webster was involved in the trial, which made it even more famous. So anyway, Hawthorne knew all of this. He was in Salem at the time, and he used this murder as the basis for what is really not a murder in his novel. It's really the death of the uncle who finds Judge Pynchon ransacking his office. Right, this guy Jaffrey Pynchon discovers his nephew attempting to steal from him. He has a stroke. He falls down, hits his head, and that allows Judge Pynchon to pin the crime of robbery and murder on his cousin Clifford. So Hawthorne adapted elements of this famous murder, but he didn't make it a grisly murder story. He removed the guilt of murder from this story and made it into an equivalent attempt to get money from a wealthy relative.
I see. Well, and to round things out, I'm going to synthesize our last two questions.
Sure.
So I'm kind of curious what the reception of the novel was when it was published in 1851, and how you would compare it to Hawthorne's other works of fiction.
Yeah, so it got good press, got good reviews. It built on his reputation that was started with the Scarlet Letter, and he sold a few thousand copies. It was not wildly runaway bestseller. I mean, a bestseller at the time for some sentimental fiction could be like 100,000 copies, because this was the era when the first true bestsellers were occurring. It got positive reviews. People loved the fact that it had comedy in it, that it didn't end with, depressing finale like the Scarlet Letter. And so it's considered Hawthorne's most cheerful and comic performance in fiction. And that's something that a lot of people might not realize who read the Scarlet Letter in high school, and say, I never want to read Hawthorne again. They don't realize that his next book was quite entertaining, got some wonderful characters. It's based on contemporary history, and is quite funny at times.
Well, I thought that was an incredibly enlightening session. I think what was opaque and obscure is incredibly lucid to me now, and hopefully anyone who watched and listened to this on the Noetic app and website feels the exact same way as I do. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, I just want to encourage everyone to go out and crack open the books, reread or even listen to this book. There's a good recorded books version of it that you can probably find in your local library or online. So
yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you, Dr. Cook.
Okay. You're welcome.
All right. Bye.